Hello, hello. It's lovely to see you all. Beautiful faces. Today we're going to be thinking about is AI conscious? So let's just begin with what is this thing that we've called consciousness? Right? Like, what is this seemingly magical property that we think about? And as you all know, it's not an easy thing to answer. It's unclear how we can best proceed with what we know to answer what could be a relatively simple question of what does it mean to be conscious? It's simple in the sense that we kind of see it all around us. It's part of our nature. It's part of the lived experience of systems that we're familiar with. But it's not clear exactly how to pin it down. And how hard could it be? Well, there literally is something called, as some of you know, the hard problem of consciousness. That speaks to the difficulty, perhaps. Now, this is a philosophy rabbit hole. We're not gonna be solving the hard problem of consciousness today. This particular problem is about how subjective experiences could ever arise from entirely physical processes. That could be quite mysterious, and I'm going to put down this rabbit hole logo to say that deserves separate treatment. Now, how can we make this even harder? Well, we can ask, what types of systems are conscious? And why might this be harder? It's because consciousness has traditionally been studied in the context of human beings, which we're relatively familiar with, because we're them. But what about systems we know less about? And some of you might be thinking about back of your heads, well, maybe we shouldn't be asking about consciousness, we should be asking about sentience. Maybe we should be thinking about welfare subjects, we should be thinking about moral patients. Again, exactly how these concepts relate to each other can be quite complicated. It's going to be another philosophy rabbit hole that deserves separate treatment. For the purposes of this talk, you can just basically assume these things collapse in one way or another. And we're interested in this idea of consciousness, welfare subjects, as one. And so you might be thinking, okay, if we're going to embark on this very hard question of pinning down consciousness, someone must be paying attention at the other end. Who will care? Like, what if we do all this hard work? What's going to be the payoff? And then the answer is some labs and some people already do, as illustrated by the very existence of this event. At least the people part. With the labs part, we have this tweet, 20-second made, so a week and a half ago. Rosie, an ex-OpenAI employee, is congratulating Anthropic for releasing this welfare chapter on the very system card for the model. Earlier in the year, Anthropic had this article exploring model welfare. Title of the video, Could AI Models Be Conscious? Who are these people? Some of these people are in the event. Patrick and Robert led this report back in 2023, which by now I think we can consider quite influential, which seeks to think about and classify information that we have about some of the best theories of consciousness and how to best proceed with that. More recently, they're saying, call to action, Jeff Sieber, who spoke earlier, they're saying, please take AI welfare seriously. This is something that matters. Let's see why. Like, why should we care? Why bother? There are many things we could say. I'm gonna say two things. Suppose that we have AI in our society. There's AI everywhere. And we have a myriad of systems, and we give them a stake in our society, in some way or another. We perhaps give them rights. We might even give them the right to vote. We try and protect their preferences in some way. we do all these things, and then we figure out, or it turns out, without us figuring out, that they're not conscious, that they're not actually beings that experience reality in the way that we do, and that we would want to give them a stake in society the way that we have. So this amounts to a huge misallocation of resources. All those things could have been better spent in other very pressing problems. That's not a great outcome. Perhaps more likely though, as some of you might have suspected, another outcome is AI is everywhere and we don't protect it at all. We don't give it any stake in our society. We are essentially mistreating it in some way, perhaps even torturing it. But you don't have to go that far, even if it's just tiny bits of suffering, because of the scale that digital minds could be in. This could be the next moral catastrophe that humanity has caused. This is why we should bother, among other things. Now, okay, some people might listen, we should care. What now? There's this enormous amount of uncertainty. People have been thinking about some of these sub-problems for millennia, and we haven't pinned down answers that we're comfortable with. So this vast uncertainty is just the reality. This is just our starting point. The question becomes, the mission becomes, what can we do in the face of that uncertainty, given that we want to do something, and we want to do something relatively well-structured? All right, so far, we've motivated the problem, and next, I'm going to introduce this idea that we've been working on, this model, digital consciousness model, and we're going to do that by looking at some key ingredients, then some assumptions that went into the model. Then I'm going to talk about stances. I'm going to explain what those are in a second. We're going to look at some early model results, and we're going to think about what the future could hold. So some key ingredients. The first is stances. So you might just think of these as the best theories of consciousness that we have in our world today. We don't call them theories. Theories is not a bad name, but we don't call them theories because we want to allow for things that are not just what formal philosophy work says. So that doesn't neatly fit the framework that a lot of the literature is working with. We also want to include those. We want those as well, but we don't just want those. In part because we think philosophy might be wrong about some of these things, and because we want to capture other people's intuitions and other things that don't fit neatly. So some examples of what stances could be, how person-like a system is. So that could be a good guide to whether something is conscious, or at least a view that someone could hold. How biologically analogous it is to us, and then some more formal ones that some of you are familiar with, global workspace, hot theory, which incidentally does not stand for how attractive the theory is. It's higher order thought, and we're going to look at that briefly. Once we have the stances, we're going to think about the key characteristics that those stances are preoccupied by. So things like attention, memory, what are the key components that those stances posit are key to establishing consciousness in any particular system. So attention, intelligence, language ability, complexity, the ability to self-model. And lastly, at the lowest level, we have small puzzle pieces, which we call indicators. And the literature also calls some of these indicators. And the idea is, these features are still too abstract for us to ask the relevant scientific questions. And so we want to precify these, and we ask more precise questions like, can X system have mood states? Is it carbon-based? Does it have a persistent identity? Can it self-recognize? And with the self-recognition, there's a very neat indicator of, or rather a test of an indicator, which is the mirror test. You show a system a mirror, can it recognize itself? There's a whole interesting question of how do you adapt that to things like LLMs. That's an example of an indicator. All right, so if those are the key ingredients, what's the recipe? So the recipe is mix these key ingredients until you get probability of consciousness. And then you might ask, oh, okay, so that's easy. How do you do the mixing? You do it like this. We implemented what social scientists like to call hierarchical Bayesian models. And basically the idea is you have different layers, and these layers inform one another. So your probability of consciousness depends on what each of your stances is saying that particular system is, whether it's conscious or not. Then those in turn depend of some collection of features, and then those features can be understood in terms of their indicators, and those are the tests for whether or not features are being absent or present. And then the idea here is we have Bayesian frameworks because we have a Bayesian way of updating these beliefs on each of these nodes. And we can talk about that if there's time and if there's interest. Let's just briefly look at an example. So we have a stance feature and an indicator. For a stance, we could have higher order thought, which basically says systems are conscious when they have a thought about a thought. And you might think, okay, to have a thought about a thought, perhaps the feature of self-modeling is very relevant here. Whether you have a model of yourself and you can model that thought is key. And then ultimately, to see if you have self-modeling, you might be thinking about, can you even self-recognize? This is a first step towards the feature, which is a step towards the stance. By no means is this the only feature that matters. By no means is this the only indicator. This is just an example. Because we're in a role, we'll do another one. Biological analogy, perhaps simpler in some ways. You just ask, is it made of organic matter? And ultimately you are asking the question, is it carbon-based? As opposed to silicon-based or something else. And then this is a reminder that I should at least mention something on this linkage. So what we have here is basically evidential strengths between these things, and these are not made equal, right? So it doesn't have to be that by virtue of just being an indicator that has the same relationship to the feature as the other indicators, and the same goes from features to stances. And you might try and capture what some of the frameworks in philosophy think of as necessary and sufficient conditions this way. It's not a perfect match, but you can do a pretty good job. All right, so some assumptions that go into this. Conditional independence, so conditional on the thing above being present or absent, all the things below are independent. Now, if this breaks, this could lead to overconfidence in the model, because basically, whatever your answers are saying about the indicators, if they're not actually independent, then they're providing more information than they should provide. Because really, they're providing correlated bits of information. We're also choosing beta distributions for the priors. Don't worry about that. Basically, unimodal, particular distribution. If this so happens to be a terrible way of describing beliefs about this, or the way that these evidential strengths work, then that would be an issue for this particular model. But they're pretty flexible, and hopefully they do a good enough job. And then two more things about nodes. One is that we're assuming ultimately that they're meaningful and consistent. If one of the nodes wasn't meaningful, then that's just adding noise, like finding out whether or not a node is present or absent. Ultimately, it's just noise if it wasn't meaningful, and they have to make sense together as well. We are also assuming that the nodes are binary. This might appear stronger than it is, and we can tell about it if you so desire. But ultimately, we're saying mathematically for each node, either you have that feature or you don't have it, either you have that indicator or you don't have it, so on and so forth. All right, so let's look at some stances. I'm not going to be able to run all my examples, but global workspace arises when information from specialized modules is broadcast across a mental workspace, making it widely accessible for other cognitive processes. So for example, you might be at a party, God forbid, and then you hear your name from across the room, and then your specialized module, your auditory module, turns and receives that information then that information is broadcasted via the workspace globally, and then other modules kick in, like your language module, to process and interpret that sound, and then your attention shifts your focus so that you can turn to this stimuli. And the moment that that information is available for other modules to utilize, then that experience becomes consciousness, or so the stance says. And it's based on one of the more developed theories of consciousness in the philosophical literature. Next we have person-like, pretty much what it says on the title. How much does it feel like you're treating with a person, interacting with a person? That's what the stance says. You might think this is like done. That's fine. We're not saying we endorse any of these. Next, biological analogy. Again, best evidence we have for consciousness in a system is its similarity to us. That's what that particular view says. And we want to have that view, again, not necessarily our favorite view. We also have cognitive complexity, which seeks to capture this intuition that intelligence and a certain level of cognitive complexity will mean that there's consciousness in that system. And then higher order thought theory, what I mentioned, having a thought about a thought, consciousness emerging from the ability of a system to represent its own mental state. How many people, just show of hands, how many people here are relatively familiar with at least one of these before? We're already familiar with at least one of them. Okay, and how many people were familiar with 3 or more? Who wants to say what their favorite one might be? Just a brave volunteer. Jonathan.
Well, I'd say biological analogy seems to be, in my opinion, probably more of a prerequisite, but not
so
sufficient.
Necessary, but not cool. Yeah, and there are possibilities of combining them as well. I should say these are 5 examples. In our first version of the model, we have 12, and you'll briefly see them. There's more, and you could keep adding them. Right. So stances, pros and cons. I think I'll do 1 or 2 of these stances, but I won't go through all of them. Global workspace, since we've devoted some time to it, perhaps the best developed theory of consciousness in animals in neuroscience and philosophy, explains some key aspects of consciousness, including its relationship with attention and its cognitive function. Some cons is that it was developed for human and animal consciousness. Theory can be unclear on what's required for a global workspace and other kinds of entities. In particular, we're interested in AI. Unclear what is required there. Maybe capturing axis consciousness instead of phenomenal consciousness, so making information available rather than the feeling of, like, the qualia. Person-like is basically saying, we love Turing tests. We love this idea that if you can fool us and you quack like a conscious being, then you are a conscious being. The downsides are that they might not actually have to do with features that seem to matter. For example, having eyes might help you fool someone that you're conscious and has nothing to do with consciousness in principle. It may be unduly anthropocentric. I'm going to skip some of these other ones in the interest of time. If you are interested to hear more, we can run back. Higher order thought weakness. Requiring metacognition might entail that some non-human animals lack consciousness, right? So it's unclear whether dogs can have a thought about a thought, and we might want to say that dogs are conscious. I think that's a good thing to say. Some early results. What have we observed so far? So let's look at AI. Finally, the AI part of the talk. Here are the 12 stances. You can ignore anything that's not the 5 that we were focusing on, which are over here on this side. So we have global workspace, person-like, biological analogy, cognitive complexity, higher order thought. And you can see how, from our calibration, with the data we've gathered so far, which is not enough, we have a pretty wide distribution. So the way to read this is this is just how the data is fitting, and then a bunch of the distribution here a bunch of density here, and there's less density towards the ends. Here, for example, global workspace is predicting that AI is like just very, very much not conscious. Same with biological analogy. This is kind of good news, right? Like, we would expect biological analogy to not do well, at least the way we've interpreted it. There might be other versions that are different. Person-like, it could be that some AIs are pretty good at fooling us, at least in certain circumstances. And that's something to keep in mind. Higher order thought theory, around 10% consciousness. But these are non-zero, right? Like, these are estimates that are not 0.0001. There might be some assumptions that go into causing that, but I think it's worth flagging. Now let's do just a quick thing to keep things very honest. If you put different inputs, you will get different outputs. That is to say, if you observe different indicators, if you have different evidential weights calibrations, the model will say different things, for sure. And so this is just an example where we have two different calibrations, A and B, and you can see how there's like, roughly they're correlated, but they're like sometimes quite different. This one's more like 0.4, and this one's more like 0.55, and this one's like near 0, and this one's more like 0.16 for global workspace. So this matters, and this is a live issue. Zoom in. All right, so what happens with other systems? I think something that can be quite valuable here is thinking about benchmark systems that we know better than AI. So in particular, we think we know human beings better than AI. We think we know chickens better. What happens with those? So when we run the model, with all the data that we have so far, these are the results we get. So AI is coming up around 0.1, so 10% conscious. Chickens are 0.35. Human beings are not 100%, above 0.8. This is kind of funny, right? Like, there are many reasons why you might not have chickens and humans where you would expect. One of them is that your theory is doing more or less than you thought it was doing. Another one is that we actually, the way this works, I mentioned it was Bayesian. You start with a prior. And for this particular slide, which is important context, we used the same prior for all three. That's what we wanted to do for the experiment. And we assumed, to begin with, that each system had a 1 in 6 chance to be conscious. So 0.17. So a lot of the information and the interesting part is the direction of updating, right? So with LLMs, the digital consciousness model actually thinks, it's lower. The median thought is that it's lower than the prior. And both for chickens and humans, it's gone up. And it's gone substantially more up for humans, but it still has for chickens. Now, there's a lot of information embedded in the chickens one, for example. And what we're doing here is we're taking these stances, there's actually 12 of them, but let's just think of these 5, and then we're mixing them. So for that particular exercise, we're pulling this data, and we're assuming that all of these are equally plausible, which is not the right thing to assume more broadly. And I think we want to be smart about what we assume. So ideally, what you could do, which would be already much better, is you take this list, you assign credences to that list, and you say, okay, I think this is 30%, I think this is 20%, I think this is 10, 30%, something like this. And then you mix them with those weights. So if you think something is 50%, it's going to pull your posterior belief very much towards that stance. And I think that's much better than assigning equal weights, kind of like, I just don't know. And remember, this is kind of what comes out of it. So it's having some of the distribution over here because some of the stances, but ultimately because there's so many stances that are around this line, it's ending up with a median around this. It's nice to see that all of them went up. I think chickens are conscious. All right. So what does the future hold? And in particular, what is my wish list? And this is where I get to talk about what I want to see happen. So one thing I want to see happen is people with knowledge of the functioning of these systems, i.e. you guys, can help us calibrate our inputs. This is a mammoth task, and we require help. for this to be a useful framework and to calibrate it in the best ways possible. So hopefully you guys can help us all calibrate this model better. The hope is that this framework is something that other people build on. So each indicator, each feature, each stance is not just one paper, but a series of papers in that field. And we're very aware of this. And we want to take those papers and help feed better data, and initially judgments, but eventually when there's data, and this is the next point, inserting data, so that we have posteriors that are informed with much better beliefs. We want to calibrate the linkages in a very similar fashion, have the right evidential weights and strength. Could this become an eval, since they're so popular these days anyway? It could be that this whole system very easily gives you a posterior probability of consciousness, and then that gets updated over time as more information becomes available, as the system changes. So you could already do this with LLMs from 2022 and 2024 and see how that posterior looks different. We haven't. We want to. There's just not enough time and resources. And also, each indicator could become its own eval. So it's self-recognition, the eval of self-recognition, which then feeds into this whole framework in the way that we are describing. Ultimately, what we want is a guide to navigate this vast uncertainty that we talked about. It's unclear how to best proceed, and it's unclear that we'll know how to best proceed, but I think we should try anyway. And the hope is that a framework like this one can ultimately help us make better decisions. Thank you very much. And now, just before the Q&A actually, I wasn't kidding when I said you guys can help us calibrate this model. This QR is for exactly that. So you can answer some questions, some of them rather technical, and hopefully our model will be better for it. And the questionnaire here is about LLMs specifically. But if you're interested in doing a different version of it, just put it on your name. Put like Jonathan Humans.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you answered this in some way, but if you decided that both humans and chickens have a 100% probability of being conscious, could you work backwards and figure out what that would imply about the weightings of the different models?
Yeah, for sure. I think, so there are a number of things that are happening as to why we didn't see those numbers go up to 100%. One of them is that there are not enough runs. So like you have a prior, and then you insert some data, and you let the model run, and it's like inching up.
But if you do it the other way, I mean...
Sure.
Yeah.
But then, exactly, so you could say, all right, this must be, you could diagnose and say, okay, I want it to collapse to 100% at this particular speed. So what I'm saying is, at this particular speed, it might actually be reasonable that we're not 100%, because that would be updating really quickly towards 100%. But if we thought that was the right speed to update to, then yes, you can go back and play around with the linkages and calibrate those according to them. And that's precisely the use case of benchmarks, is that it allows us to see, okay, like, we should throw some skepticism on the AI estimate, given that we're not seeing what we think in the human and chicken's case, what we think we should see. And remember that this was just an example of 5 stanzas. Also, they're not very plausible. Like, it could just be that these stanzas in particular are very limited, and mixing them equally is not going to give you the results that you expect. So it's only when you have stanzas that you think are the correct ones that you should do the thing you're suggesting, but it's a great idea. Sure.
It feels like quite a lot of the work's being done by the prior, as in like that's why it didn't reach 100% partly combined with like the number of runs and the prior. Like, yeah, I'm a bit confused like how important that is, and also if you have like played around with different priors and stuff, and then kind of like combining is related to I kind of want to know like what's the answer, like what's your actual view of the probability that LLMs are, like having done this research. I know it's not the whole thing, but like you having done this, like what's your actual current view or something?
Yeah, I hate copying out.
Yeah.
No, but I'm gonna for that particular, just because I genuinely don't think these 5 stances, which is the ones that we've worked on, capture the best view that we can come up with. I can tell you what it is according to them, and I have. I don't think that's entirely right. Exactly what the influence of the prior is on the pursuit, like how important it is. Yes, I think this is something to do sensitivity analysis on. It's something that we're going to do sensitivity analysis on. We're satisfied with the way it works now. So it's kind of what I was talking about earlier with the speed of updating. We don't want something to be overly anchored on the prior. We also don't want it to just jump the moment that you see, okay, passes the merit test, 100% conscious, yeah, go. Which are the 2 extremes. So yeah, it's ultimately a balancing game. And we'll know more as we have more observations. Yes.
Sorry if you already touched on this ultimately, but I mean, other than intuition, I think the main reason why I logically believe that humans and animals are sentient is because of evolution, because there's a reason for them to be sentient. Do you use that line of reasoning for AI? Like, is it like seeing if there's a reason for them to be sentient in order to figure out?
Yeah, so evolution is one of the, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but it's like evolution, suitability, or like reasoning for existence given evolution is one of the features that we have. And so insofar as some of the views care about this, which not all of them do, like some views might just be completely agnostic about however this being came about, let's just look at the being. And others are very much interested, especially the biological analogy one, could just very much use this idea of, okay, like what's the story behind this conscious or not conscious system? But yeah, absolutely, it's one of the features that you could think about.
I wonder if some of this work has already been done for animal sentience research.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, when scientists are trying to figure out which animals are sentient, they are already using different theories and, treating some indicators as stronger than others.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you're using that to inform your work.
Yeah.
And a concern that I have about this framework is that when you give people these 5 theories to assign priors to, I think it encourages people to take each one as plausible.
Yeah.
When in my view, at least one of them there was like totally silly for me anyway.
I understand. I should clarify a few things. I'm so glad you asked this. One, just on your last point, we're not asking people for their credences on the stances. We're only asking people about particular indicators. So does this thing pass the merit test? Okay. So those are the questions that we're asking. We also selected between 100 and 200 experts and are in touch with them, asking them about these indicators. Again, not the stances. Although the stances is also an interesting question for separate reasons, but comes with baggage, as you pointed out. Right. One of the people on the team, on the Probability Investigations team, is Bob Fisher, who is one of the lead people with the Moral Weights project. And basically the task of that project was exactly summarizing that literature that you're thinking about, and we're definitely keeping an eye on that. There is a lot of work that just doesn't translate super well to digital systems where you have like a browser open interacting with them. There's like a lot of biological frameworks break down. But absolutely, we want to keep an eye on that for sure, 100%.
So this work is really helpful to understand, like, given a stance, what is the probability that systems are confident? But does it get us any closer to figuring out which stance is actually correct? Because to me, that still seems like we're not any closer to. Yeah. You basically have to take a stance first and then assess the probability after the fact.
Yeah. So a few things to say about this. That's a good question. One is that, are you familiar with this idea of cause X? That maybe there's like a certain cause that we haven't thought about that is more important than other causes, causes being areas of interest in altruistic resources, and animal welfare is one cause, global healthcare is another. You could do something similar here. You could have a stance X, which is basically saying, this is the stance of the kind of unknowns, and you could try and formalize that and bring that into the framework. One thing I'll say is I basically agree with you that if you think all of the stances that you have are ultimately rubbish, then you're not going to pay much heed to the output, because you're going to think, okay, like this is ultimately not, like, these might be the best theories that we have, but they're still not very good in an absolute sense. The hope here is to when we have these better theories, insert those. And the thought is also that we're going to have to make decisions under uncertainty very soon, if not already. And we should use what's most evidence-backed and be as thoughtful as possible. And this is our attempt to be as thoughtful as possible. Last thing I'll say, you could update your credences if you're confident in the way certain relationships work between the system. You could do the trick that Jonathan was talking about earlier and say, I expect these systems to be conscious because I know a bunch about them. And the stances that are telling me they're not conscious, I can roll back, or I can like lower my credence on. So you can definitely do that exercise worth doing.
You were talking about the moral weights problem and how you just the moral weights exercise, and you just can't apply a bunch of the things because they like local values, they don't want the digital system.
Yeah.
For those ones, do you then say that like that updates you down, or do you say that test is wrong? Because there's like what I struggle to understand is like, is sentience a universal thing?
Yeah.
Like is there sentience, like two different types of sentience, and in which case you have two different sets of tests?
Yeah. I think we don't want to put our foot down on either of these things. We want to remain agnostic about some of these more abstract questions.
Yeah.
And we want to say, you might think that it's just one kind of thing. You formalize that kind of thing and you ask the relevant questions, in which case you would maybe update down.
Yeah.
Or you don't. And in which case you try and adapt the questions so that they fit the kind of sentience or consciousness that you're concerned with. So to make it fair, so to speak, you ask a different type of mirror. It's like a physical mirror with a chicken, and it's a screenshot with an LLM, which is kind of ultimately two different things.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk. The session's now over.